Hello everyone, my name is Richard Thomas, and I'm going to be presenting joint work with Joe Gardiner, Tom Chothia, Emmanouil Samanis, Josh Perrett, and Rashid in looking at CVEs from an ICS perspective, particularly for risk management and helping asset owners understand how they can secure their systems. Now, obviously, because this is a IoT ICS workshop, it's good to get off to a good start by saying what an industrial control system is. Really, at the heart of it is industrial automation. So you're taking your people, plant, and process and automating it in some way. That reduces your costs, increases your efficiency, unless you see what's actually going on inside that process. Now, these systems are sense-based systems which have logic-based rules. So given some input, I will map that directly to an output. Using an example of a conveyor belt, I see a box, pass a sensor, work out the size of the box, and I know which piston to fire to push it off in the right way. We talk a lot about Industry 4.0, the age of automation in the industrial sector. And these systems, so the ones you see, for example, in the picture there, a mix of programmable logic controllers, human-machine interfaces, some network gear that has an industrial certification. That's really how we deliver this strategy. Now, as Alvaro mentioned, I'm from the railway sector in security, and we're now seeing a change of device posture. So previously we were maintaining safety of the process as fail-safes. Now these systems are being deployed as the safety system for the entire function. So in the UK, we actually have a signaling system, something that says two trains can't occupy the same bit of track, actually being operated by these systems. It's really interesting. Now, these also are being seen as the new target. We've seen attacks like Stuxnet and a few other attacks over time, and it's because you can create disruptive attacks. Now, why is this? They've got legacy protocols. So things like Profitnet, Modbus, BACnet, so on and so forth. They really, at the core of it, like we saw in the presentation a few minutes ago, these were previously very constrained devices. So we couldn't afford any kind of encryption or authentication. And even today, the device might be more powerful, but we've kept on to those original design assumptions. Very unlike my phone or tablet, which lasts probably 2-3 years, these devices are designed to work consistently from the time they're installed for decades on end. A train in the UK, for example, 50 years is going to last. And so we have to think about security in a very different way. Traditionally, I would go out to a system integrator and say, hey, I've got a power plant, can you build it? And all the deployment would be bespoke to me. Now, that means that an attacker would have to target your system individually, and anything they developed would only work against that deployment. It wouldn't work elsewhere. Now, with commercial off-the-shelf ICS devices, it means that one attack can scale across many deployments and many sectors. Attacks are evolving. So Stuxnet, WannaCry were really disruptive in that moment in time. So Stuxnet really changed configuration so it would immediately create havoc. But we're now seeing subtly changing configurations. So it would lie in wait. And that's what we saw with Triton. So it was changing the parameters of that safety instrumentation system so that it would never have kicked in. Now, obviously, what we've learned from Triton is we saw weird behavior that could have prevented Triton ever occurring, and we could have actually acted a lot earlier. And the key question that we want to ask as researchers was, how do we help asset owners understand their risk position and also make sure that they get the right information? So understand what the threat landscape is, understand what they need to act upon. So I'm an asset owner. What do? I look at open source reporting. And the first place most people go, we spoke to a few practitioners. If you don't pay for threat intelligence services, you would go to a CVE record if you knew what was affected from a vulnerability advisory from your vendor, or you would look at ICS-cert, which is pretty much a good source of truth for whole sector devices. And that would at least let you know whether or not you're affected, because you can say, this vulnerability, different vendor, not me. This vulnerability, not my product. If it was my product, I could then think about what I needed to do based on the mitigations they propose. And also, unless you understand how long you're exposed, so based on the vulnerability timeline that some of these advisories include, you can say, okay, I had this particular version of firmware that was affected. I've been running it for 3 years. I should probably patch it. Like also these contain indicators of compromise. So what should I be looking for on my network that I could potentially block in the perimeter? As I said, with Triton, do these reports actually let me understand what unexpected behavior in my environment was? So if something was just randomly failing, could this have been the reason? But for NAS owner, accuracy of those reports are vital. So any kind of inconsistency or even contradiction, that can have severe consequences because you may say, I'm not affected. I don't need to do anything. They also lack contextual information. So things that I need to do right here, right now, or things I can include in my risk management process. So, how long was this patch out for? Was it for 3 or 4 years? How many am I really behind? And just to show you the types of information we were dealing with, we were going from the sources of truth are cross-sector to using Siemens as a case study. And I'll talk about that why. So looking at the firmware history release, and then likewise, how long was our product on the market for? When was it released to the customers? And likewise, how long has it been out of service? How long has Siemens said you shouldn't be, you can't buy this anymore? So our research question was really focused around Siemens ICS CVEs. Why? They had the highest CVE prevalence compared to other vendors in industrial control systems. That's not to say they're more insecure than another. Part of the reason is because they've increased their focus on product assurance. So they've got product cert. Within 24 hours, you should have some kind of contact if you report a vulnerability with them. Certainly from Bristol on our side, we've had really good feedback with them. The other good important thing is all the information that we used for our research was public. So things like how long the firmware was out for, hardware release dates and release notes. So we could try and trace back when that vulnerability first entered the market. Other vendors require support contracts, so it's quite hard to get to. So research question, using that Siemens information, how long was Siemens specific ICS vulnerabilities in the wild? And moreover, how accurate was that information represented for the Siemens customers, and how consistent was it? And just to show sort of the vendor count, why we chose Siemens. So out of 2,000 odd CVs, Siemens had about 20% of them. Now, there has been quite a lot of work recently. The last ICS cert sort of state of security was published about 4 years ago, but didn't look at risk exposure or giving enough information to help you understand risk to your environment. There's been a lot of work in the IT domain. So there has been some work on open source projects, particularly Chrome and say MyPHP, where you could actually go back in time, see the exact commit that introduced that vulnerability. And the researchers found it was between 10 and 14 months. So, just under 4 years. Kaspersky Lab, in particular for ICS, they looked at how vulnerabilities were getting patched. And good news, 85% were getting patched. But what's really concerning is 6% of the vulnerabilities that were reported, the vendors had said, we will not patch. Maybe it was too old. And it's that 6% we really cared about because a NASA owner really needs to know whether or not they need to act or what they could be exposed to. Dragos has actually been doing some work on ICS CVE correctness, but mainly from a CVSS perspective. CVSS I'm not going to talk about and get into that debate for ICS, but it showed that there was actually a significant amount of incorrectness in the ecosystem. It's getting better though, as you can see on the screen. And when a CVE is first reported, it gets published by NVD, but the National Vulnerability Database. But their experts don't really do much. As Ronan last year found, within about less than half a year, they actually found that it was taking that long to publish more information about that particular vulnerability. So where do I stand as an asset owner? What do I need to do? So to really get a nice data set for our research, we scraped ICS cert to get references to CV numbers, the vendors, and the particular lists of products affected. And we started that from about 2011 when ICS started, and we brought it right up to about April 2019. And the picture you see on the screen now is the workflow we followed. So it's just some technical scraping, conversion, parsing, and as you see on the right-hand side, a lot of expert work. It was quite a lot of manual work, and I'll touch on why it took that long to try and develop this data set. And Through to April 2020, we had a pretty good data set of about 1,100 ICS advisories, so things that may have more than one CVE attached to them, 2,300 CVEs, and from that, we had 44,000 CPs. These are called common product enumerations. So these are strings that represent a particular product, application, hardware version. The dataset is completely live. It's just gone up today, and we do encourage the research community to use it and tell us what you think of it. So all the expert analysis really had to work for this case. Why? As I said, just a reminder, 2,300 CVs were collated and 424 were Siemens. We had a lot of noise though. When we were looking at the CPEs, there was a lot of application CVs. So things like in the Siemens world, TIA Portal, programming software for Siemens software, as well as Windows CVs, which was quite weird. So we filtered out to give us just pure hardware and firmware affecting things, the things that ICS CVs really talk about. The whole manual effort was because when we started going to the vendor to find out how long this vulnerability could have been out for, Siemens Industry More, which says how long the product has been out, and Siemens Industry Support, which says here's a firmware history, they're manually curated. So it meant that dates were in very different formats. Even if you switch between languages and countries, you're switching from date, month, year to year, month, date. We even saw month, year, date in some cases. So say for every CV, we had to do about 3 or 4 spot checks to make sure the date format was spot on and to try and coalesce all the information we had. We also saw cases where in the CV record, it said all versions affected, full stop. But really, it meant we had to go hunting because we had to find what the earliest reference date of a version for that affected product was. And where they gave version ranges, say version 3.0 to 3.5, we had to try and find when version 3.0 came out. And if we couldn't find it, we had to go for version 3.1. We also saw that in quite a few cases that there was portfolio acquisition. So a lot of these products weren't actually Siemens. They were actually companies that used to be Siemens and were bought out years ago, but they were still being attributed to Siemens. So it is some quick highlights about these data sets. We took the data we had, so that 200 odd CVs, and we split them. We created 2 data sets out of that. There is a bit of overlap between the two though. One was a temporal data set, so things about how long that vulnerability was out in the wild, and an inconsistency data set to say how inconsistent are these CV records. We want to see who was reporting these Siemens CVs. So the table shows that how Siemens product cert really has come to its own over time. But you do see smatterings of, say, the MITRE Corporation or CERT out of Cornell, really still publishing a few CVs. Now, the reason for this is, say, with the Cisco one, if there was a vulnerability found in Cisco kit, it might be co-branded as Siemens for an industrial environment. So Cisco would have reported that CVE and it would have been shown as affecting Siemens stuff. We want to see, is the number of vulnerability reports rising? And it looks to be over time. Now, obviously, 2020 has been an interesting year, so we don't have the full statistics there. And also, what is the breakdown by severity? So is it the case that a hardware and firmware vulnerability is more severe than all of Siemens' portfolio? So to answer this question of how long Siemens ICS CVs were in the world, we looked at for that earliest date of the firmware version being out for. So for out of the 207 CVs, we could get 165 dates. And on average, so thinking about that 10 to 40 months for, say, open source projects, in ICS, we don't have that luxury of going back in time. We had, using our manual effort, we found that on average, from the release to the vulnerability report, so there's that CV coming out, it's about 5.2 years. We did have a few outliers, which we did discount. In the shortest case, it's 115 days. But out of that, we wanted to ask another question of, did the type of vulnerability, so I think where there was a web-based vulnerability, whether there was a buffer overflow vulnerability, did that really influence the time to discovery? And likewise, is there a relationship between the time to discover and the severity? So we did some statistical tests, and you can find that on the paper. We found there wasn't any relationship. But this graph is quite interesting, you can see. So yellow denotes a low criticality vulnerability, orange, medium, and the sort of dark red maroon color, that's critical high vulnerabilities. And what you can see on that graph, each line is a specific CVE. So it shows the range of dates that that vulnerability could have been out in the wild. And you can see there is no correlation between the type of vulnerability and how long it was out in the wild. So it's quite random looking. So that was one interesting result we had. And think about how accurate the ICS CVE information was. We're seeing a lot of customers in industrial automation sectors, especially, say, as Alvaro mentioned from my background, is in the NIS directive in the EU, which is to develop the cybersecure culture and also reporting culture. A lot of organizations I've spoken to use automated threat intelligence platforms. So they will ingest ICS CVE information and say, are you affected, yes or not? And here's some information about it. You've got to have that information right from the source. If it's wrong, it will just propagate and you'll have bad quality data throughout. That also increases your risk of an uninformed asset owner. Now, the way that these products normally work is you give a list of products or keywords that these platforms should look out for. Now, that CPE vector, that product, you've got to make sure you're pretty damn accurate. If you get one digit wrong, that product won't flag in your system. And you have to be quite flexible in your granularity. So you could say, using Siemens as an example, I want to look for the S7 1200 range. Now, Siemens does a massive S7 1200 range, depending on how many inputs and outputs you want. Or do you say, I want to go for the S7 1212C, a very specific product. Now, analysts will go and read that CVE, and maybe they'll go out and reach out to the vendor advisory, which will be tagged into that CVE record if it exists. Now, NVD tries to bring all this information together, and unfortunately, it's the case that they just don't quickly update this information. When we're looking at the inconsistency, we cross-reference that CPE, that product vector, with the actual CVE description to see whether they match. So this automation would pick up words in the description. And we find out of the 200 CVs, 34 mismatched. So you actually had an understatement in the list of products affected that this automated tooling would pick up. In the worst case, we actually saw where a CV said 64 products were affected, 18 were missing. So that's potentially 18 products in many environments that someone wouldn't have known they were affected. 30 actually went into very granular detail. We actually saw in some cases, it went into the ordering code for Siemens based on specific configuration. So again, you've got to be careful with your granularity and how precise you are when you're specifying these keywords. When you've got that all version CPs, NVD wasn't putting on an end date for when these when the patches were released. So that meant that you might get some fatigue in alerting. When Siemens Product Cert updated the vendor advisory, so maybe they found more products were affected or they said a patch is now available, we found that the information wasn't flowing back to the public CVE record, which Siemens can't control. Only Siemens can control the description and the number. Everything else NVD controls. Beyond Siemens, we also found typographical errors across vendors. So this case with Honeywell. And likewise, for product representation, we saw variations in how these products were getting represented. So again, a risk you're missing something. We took CVs with high numbers of affected products. I also looked at how many times the CV had been updated, whether the description had changed, whether the CPE list had changed, and also whether Siemens had updated their advisory. And we found in most cases, things weren't backflowing. And more interestingly, the two CVs that you see in the CV description column that have a little symbol, the descriptions were shortened over time. So whether you might have had 64 products, it was just a vulnerability exists in this Siemens product. That means that that automated tooling and what you present to them must be accurate because you have no other source of truth. So quickly to the effect of these inconsistencies, we carried out a search using our labs. And we looked at the level of variation. And this actually brought a lot of data to us ourselves, whether or not we were affected. And like I said, Siemens logo is the case I was talking about, where we went down to the ordering code. Some CPEs overstated the scope of that CVE, so you needed a very specific configuration to be vulnerable. And what I said with our generalization of the CVE, it's not good. We even saw contradictions. So where the CVE description said, you're not affected, but then you're affected, it just introduces doubt. Solutions. How do we fix this? Well, number one, reduce the vulnerability lifespan. So testing strategies, things that go beyond GE's Achilles program, which is designed for ICS assurance. Bug bounties we've seen very successful in the IT domain. What happens if we transform that over to the security domain? Be clear on your firmware histories. Tell people how long they've been running their kit for. That drives your patching behaviors. Improve that CP quality, making sure that automated tooling gets the right quality information first time, every time. And likewise, when a product vendor updates something, backflow as soon as possible. So update those NVD CVE records. Now, we did go to Siemens and the NVD to report these problems because we thought of it as a cause for concern. So Siemens, as a CNA, a CVE numbering authority, they confirmed they were monitoring the situation because it wasn't representing and informing their customers properly. It was beyond their control, but they were trying to work with NVD to sort it. NVD actually welcomed our suggestions and said, we're already building a roadmap to improve this process. Thank you. And we're going to start engaging with the vendors more. They've since corrected all the CVs we found to be wrong. So to conclude, you need timely and accurate reporting, otherwise your asset owners remain uninformed. ICS security is really different to the IT domain, and we still need to get over that hurdle. Those vulnerabilities look to be in the wild for longer, but it has that impact to safety. CVE correctness is still an issue and is not going to go away soon. But if you give vendors the power, it means that the information is more accurate and it gives something you can map yourselves to. You also need close integration between the vendors and NVD. So making sure those product representations are right and understood, and they are what the customers expect to use. And also as a reminder, that dataset is public. So please feel free to use it. Thank you very much for your time. Hope you enjoyed that talk. Look forward to any questions you've got. Thank you.